Good day. Today, our discussion will focus on operant conditioning and cognitive learning. It is understanding how behavior is shaped and learned. What if I told you that you'd get an extra 5 points if you turned on your camera? Would you do it or not? Hit the like button if you would. This is basically what we'll talk about today. We'll discuss whether your behavior is likely to increase with the presence of a reward or if you'd perform it simply because you've seen others do it. Let's dive into the learning theories that explain behavior through operant conditioning and cognitive approaches. Now, let's talk about E.L. Thorndike and his famous law of effect. Thorndike, Thorndike was one of the first psychologists to study how animals learn through trial and error. He conducted experiments using cats, what he called puzzle boxes. These were small boxes where he placed a cat inside. Inside the box, the cat had to figure out how to escape. And to do that, it needed to perform a specific action, like pulling a string or pressing a lever. And once the cat successfully performed the action, the box would open, and outside was its reward, a piece of fish. At first, the cat didn't know what to do. It would scratch, meow, move around randomly until by accident it pulled the string and escaped. But after several trials, the cat started escaping faster and faster, as shown in the graph. This means the cat learned which behavior led to the reward. From this, Thorndike developed that what he called the law of effect. It states that behavior followed by positive consequences are more likely to be repeated, while behaviors followed by negative consequences are less likely to recur. In simple terms, if an action brings satisfaction or a reward, we tend to do it again. But if it brings discomfort or punishment, we avoid doing it. Now that we've learned about Thorndike and his law of effect, let's move on to B.F. Skinner, who expanded on Thorndike's ideas. Skinner believed that Thorndike's law of effect was very useful because it helps explain how animals and even humans learn by the consequences of their action. He called this process operant conditioning. In simple terms, operant conditioning means that behavior is influenced by what happens after it, by its consequences. If a behavior is followed by something rewarding, it's more likely to happen again. But if it's followed by something unpleasant, it's less likely to be repeated. To study this, Skinner used what we call now the Skinner box. In this experiment, he placed a rat inside a box equipped with a lever or a bar. Every time the rat pressed the bar, it received food. But over time, the rat learned that pressing the bar leads to a reward. You can see in the graph here that as time goes on, the rat, the rat's bar pressing behavior increases. And that's because the behavior is being reinforced by food. So Skinner called this type of behavior an operant response, meaning it's a response that can be modified by its consequences. In other words, the rat's action of pressing the bar is shaped and strengthened by the result, getting food. In summary, Skinner's operant conditioning tells us what we learn to do things. I mean, in summary, Skinner's operant conditioning tells us that we learn to do things because of the outcomes they produce. Reward strengthen behavior, while negative outcomes weaken it. And this principle applies not just to animals, but to humans as well, in school, at work, or even at home. Similar to the beginning of the session, when I told you that you'd get an extra 5 points if you turned on your camera, you were more likely to do it because the outcome or reward motivated you to perform the action. And that's what operant conditioning is about. Our behaviors are shaped by their consequences. Now let's take a closer look at how it actually works in an experiment. Here, you can see a diagram of what we call the Skinner box. Inside the box, there's a rat. a response lever, food dispenser, some lights, and even loudspeakers that can be used to give signals. There is also an electrified grid, these, on the floor that can be used to deliver mild shocks as a form of punishment, although Skinner mainly focused on rewards. To demonstrate operant conditioning, Skinner considered three important factors. First, the rat has not been fed for several hours. Why? Because hunger serves as a motivation. It increases the likelihood that the rat will work for food. Second, the goal of the experiment is to condition the rat to press the bar or the lever, which is what we call an operant response, a behavior that operates on the environment to produce a consequence, in this case, receiving food. Third, Skinner used a procedure called shaping. And what is shaping? It means gradually guiding the rat's behavior toward the desired action. So at first, the experimenter gives food when the rat just moved near the bar. Later, food is given only when the rat touches the bar. Eventually, food is given only when the rat presses the bar completely. Through this step-by-step process, the rat learns which behavior earns the reward. This is how operant conditioning builds complex behavior patterns, one small step at a time. And these principles show how motivation, responses, and reinforcement work together to shape behavior. What about you? Can you share a personal experience where you were shaped to perform a specific behavior? Another points to consider in understanding operant conditioning are the following. Number one, depending on the rat and the trainer's experience, it can take anywhere from a few minutes to about an hour to train the rat to press the bar. Now, here's the important part. When the rat presses the bar, a food pellet, or what we call the reinforcer, needs to come immediately after the behavior. Why? Because the closer the reward is to the action, the easier it is for the animal to connect the two. Press the bar, get food. Simple. But here's the catch. If the reinforcer is delayed, the rat might make the wrong connection. For example, maybe right before the food appears, the rat scratches itself. Now the rat thinks scratching caused the reward, and it might start scratching over and over. And that's what we call superstitious behavior. When a behavior increases simply because it is accidentally paired with the reward. Now let's connect this to real life. Think about studying. If you review your notes and immediately reward yourself with a short break or maybe a snack, you're more likely to keep that habit. But if the reward comes much later, you might not connect it with the studying. Even with diet and exercise, timing matters. If you exercise and immediately feel good or treat yourself with a healthy way, the habit sticks better than if the reward is too delayed. Reinforcement works best when it's immediate because delays can lead to confusion or superstitious behavior. Now, question. Have you been operantly conditioned? Let's look at a very practical example of operant conditioning, toilet training. This is something many of you might have seen at home with your younger siblings or relatives. It shows us how reinforcement and shaping can be used in everyday life. Step 1, target behavior. First, we need to define the target behavior. In this case, the goal is for the child to use the toilet properly instead of diapers. Just like in Skinner's experiment, we need to be clear about what behavior we want to increase. Number 2, preparation. Parents or trainers need to make sure the environment is ready. That means having a potty chair or a toilet seat that the child can use comfortably. The child also needs to be physically and emotionally ready for this training. Now, here's the key part: reinforcers. Whenever the child makes progress, like sitting on the potty or actually using it, the parent should provide a reward. This can be praise, like very good, good girl, good boy, or clapping, yay, good job, or stickers, like here's your star for doing a good job today, or even a small treat like chocolate. The reward needs to be given immediately so that the child connects the behavior with a positive consequence. And the step is number 4, we use shaping. Remember, shaping means reinforcing small steps toward the final goal. So at first, you might reward the child for just for sitting on the potty. Later, you only reward when they or he or she actually use it correctly. Over time, the reinforcers are given for closer and closer approximations to the desired behavior until the child has mastered toilet training. You see, toilet training is really a perfect everyday example of operant conditioning. By defining the behavior, preparing the environment, using reinforcers, and shaping step by step, we can help a child learn an important life skills. What actually makes a behavior more likely or less likely to happen? Again, the answer is simple: it's the consequence. Whenever we do something, the consequence that follows can either encourage us to repeat it or discourage us from doing it again. If the consequence makes the behavior more likely to recur, we call that reinforcement. For example, if you study hard for a test and get a high grade, that positive outcome increases the chance that you'll study hard again next time. On the other hand, if the consequence makes the behavior less likely to recur, we call that punishment. For instance, if you touch a hot stove and get burned, that painful consequence decreases the likelihood that you'll touch the stove again. Remember, reinforcement is all about increasing the chance that a behavior will happen again in the future. And there are two types: positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. Positive reinforcement means adding something pleasant after a behavior to encourage it. The word positive here doesn't mean good, it just means we're adding something. For example, if a child cleans the room and the parents give them candy or praise, the presentation of candy or praise is called positive reinforcement. The reward increases the chance that the child will clean the room again. Now, here, negative reinforcement can be a little tricky because people often confuse it with punishment, but it's not punishment, okay? Negative reinforcement means we take away something unpleasant to encourage a behavior. Again, we take away something unpleasant to encourage a behavior. The word negative here means removing. For example, if you put on your seatbelt and the annoying beeping sound in the car stops, the removal is called negative reinforcement. Removing the unpleasant noise makes it more likely that you wear your seatbelt again. So here's what you need to remember: positive reinforcement, adding something pleasant to increase behavior; negative reinforcement, removing something unpleasant to increase behavior. Both are reinforcers because in the end, they strengthen the behavior. Now, the stimuli from either positive or negative reinforcements are called reinforcers. For instance, One of the main reasons you study hard for exam is to get good grades. Now, good grades is your reinforcer. Another example, if taking an aspirin removes your headache, headache removal is the aversive stimulus or reinforcer, a negative reinforcer. And reinforcers have two levels. Primary reinforcers are naturally reinforcing, meaning they satisfy our basic biological needs. We don't have to learn that these things are rewarding. They already are by nature. For instance, food. When you're hungry and you eat, it feels rewarding. Water. When you're thirsty, drinking water reinforces your drinking behavior. Sleep. After staying up late, sleeping feels good, so your body encourages you to do it again. Warmth. When you're cold and you cover yourself with a blanket, the comfort reinforces the behavior for seeking warmth. These reinforcers are powerful because they are tied directly to our survival. On the other hand, secondary reinforcers, also called conditioned reinforcers, are not naturally rewarding. Again, these are not naturally rewarding. Instead, we learn to associate them with primary reinforcers through experience. Example, money. Money itself has no biological value, but we've learned that it can buy food, water, clothes, or entertainment, things that do satisfy our needs. Another example, grades. A high grade doesn't feed you, but it feels rewarding because it's linked with praise, achievement, or future opportunities. Another example, praise or approval. When someone says, good job, it feels good because it's associated with acceptance and success. Now, punishment is a concept in operant conditioning that refers to any consequences or any consequence that decreases the likelihood of a behavior being repeated. So while reinforcement increases the behavior, punishment reduces or stops it. The goal of punishment is to weaken or eliminate an undesirable behavior. And there are two types of punishment: positive punishment and negative punishment. When we say positive, this means adding something unpleasant after a behavior in order to decrease that behavior. The word positive here doesn't mean good, it means something is added. Example, a teacher scolds a student for being noisy in class. The scolding is added to reduce the behavior. Another example, a driver receives a speeding ticket for going over the limit. The fine is added to discourage speeding. One last example, a child touches a hot stove and feels pain. The pain is added, teaching the child not to touch it again. So in positive punishment, we introduce something unpleasant or aversive right after the unwanted behavior. Now, negative punishment means removing something pleasant after a behavior in order to decrease the behavior. The word negative here means something is taken away. Example, a teenager loses phone or tablet privileges for breaking curfew. The phone, which is pleasant, is taken away. Another example, a child's toy is confiscated after misbehaving. The toy is taken away. So in negative punishment, we decrease a behavior by taking away something enjoyable or valuable. One kind of undesirable behavior in young children is the persistent refusal or parental request. I mean excessive or persistent refusal of parental request. And this is a problem called non-compliance. Non-compliance simply means refusing to follow directions or rules in a form of behavior where someone chooses not to do what is expected of them, whether it's from a teacher, parent, or authority figure. Example, if student refuses to participate in class activities, or a child ignores instruction to put away their toys, or a teenager talks back or walks away instead of doing a task. Non-compliance is common, especially among children or adolescents who are testing limits or expressing independence. But in behavioral psychology, we view non-compliance not just as disobedience, but as a learned behavior that can be modified through proper enforcement or punishment. So when non-compliance happens, what can we do? We don't necessarily have to scold, yell, or embarrass the person. That's often counterproductive. Instead, one effective and humane consequence used in both classrooms and homes is called timeout. Timeout, what is it? Timeout is a typical or negative punishment, or it's a type of negative punishment. Remember, in negative punishment, we remove something pleasant to reduce unwanted behavior. In a timeout, the individual is temporarily removed from a reinforcing or enjoyable environment. For example, playtime, social interaction, or classroom activity, right after showing inappropriate behavior such as noncompliance. So, when do we give reinforcements? To answer this question, let's talk about schedule of reinforcement. A schedule of reinforcement is basically a rule of or a program that tells us how and when a behavior will be followed by a reward. Think of it like a game plan for encouraging behavior, whether it's training a pet, shaping human habits, or even designing apps that keep us hooked. Now, check out this diagram here. And this is from the Skinner box. This is a record from the Skinner box. This is where the magic happens. It's a classic setup used by B.F. Skinner to study operant conditioning. So inside the back, there's the box, there's a rat, a liver, a food dispenser, some light, and even an electric grid. Again, let me explain this. The rat presses the lever, and depending on the schedule, it might get the food pellet. Sometimes it gets rewarded every time, sometimes only after a few presses, or maybe after a certain amount of time. That's where the different types of reinforcement schedule come in, like fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, and variable interval. Each one shapes behavior in a unique way. We will explain this in our next slides. Let's talk about this graph here. This graph is called a cumulative record. It's basically a visual diary of a rat behavior. The slope here, this slope here, shows rapid responses. The flat line means the rat taking a break. This, okay, the flat lines. Um, and those little blips, this, that's when reinforcement happens. It's like watching motivation in real time. What's cool is how this applies to real life. Ever wonder why slot machines are so addictive? Or what's in lately? Uh, Scatter. So addictive. Why? That's a variable ratio schedule in action. Or why we check our phones constantly, hoping for a new message? Yep, that's variable interval. These schedules are everywhere from classroom to social media. So yeah, reinforcement schedules are not just lab stuff, they're shaping behavior all around us. Now, let's zoom out a bit and talk about the bigger picture. There are types of reinforcement schedules. So here's the deal is not all reinforcement is created equal. Sometimes a behavior gets rewarded every single time it happens. Other times it only gets rewarded some of the time, and it makes a huge impact on how strong and long-lasting the behavior becomes. Let's break it down. First up, we've got continuous reinforcement. This one's pretty straightforward. Every time the behavior happens, it gets reinforced. Imagine giving a dog a treat every single time it sits on command. It's great for teaching new behavior because the connection between action and reward is super clear. But here's the catch. Once the reinforcement stops, the behavior tends to fade quickly. It's like no treat, no sit. Then we have partial reinforcement. And this is where things get interesting. With partial reinforcement, the behavior is only rewarded sometimes, not every time. Think of it like playing a slot machine. You don't win every time, but the possibility keeps you coming back. This kind of schedule actually makes behavior more resistant to extinction. In other words, people or animal keeps doing the behavior even when the reward is not guaranteed. So why does this matter? Because in real life, we don't always get rewarded for every good things we do. Am I right? Teachers don't always give praise. Bosses don't always give bonuses. And friends don't always say thank you. We keep doing those behaviors because we've learned that sometimes they pay off. This distinction between continuous and partial reinforcement is foundation in behavioral psychology. It helps us understand everything from habit formation to addiction, classroom management to parenting strategies. And just like in Skinner box, these schedules can be tested, graphed, and analyzed to see how behavior changes over time. Okay, now we've talked about what the differences between continuous and partial reinforcement. Let's dig deeper into the partial side of things. There are four main types of partial reinforcement schedules, and each one shapes behavior in a slightly different way. Let's break them down with some real life example. First, we've got the fixed ratio schedule. This one is all about numbers. The reinforcement happens after a set number of responses. Think of a factory worker who gets paid for after assembling 10 products. It doesn't matter how long it takes. What matters is hitting the number. So the behavior, assembling, is reinforced after every 10 units. This kind of schedule tends to produce a high rate of responding. People work hard to hit the target, but there's often a little pause right after the reward, like, whoo, I earned my pay. Now I'll take a breather. Number two, we've got the fixed interval schedule. This one's based on time, not action. For example, picture a student who gets a quiz every Friday. They know it's coming, so their studying behavior ramps up right before Friday. The reinforcement, grades, or feedback comes at a predictable time. This schedule creates a kind of scalloped pattern in behavior. There's a pause after the reinforcement, then a burst of activity as the next one approaches. It's like cramming the night before a test. Classic fixed interval behavior. Number three, variable ratio schedule. This one's a game changer. Here's why. Reinforcement happens after a random number of responses. You never know when it's coming, but it could be the next one. Think of a slot machine. Try to pull the lever again and again, hoping the next spin will be the jackpot. This schedule creates very high and steady response rate, and it's also the most resistant to extinction. That's why it's used in gambling, video games, and even social media likes. It keeps us hooked. And finally, we have variable interval schedule. This one is also based on time, but the timing is unpredictable. Imagine checking your email. Sometimes a new message pops up in 5 minutes, sometimes it takes 2 hours. Since you don't know when the reinforcer or a new message will arrive, you keep checking. This schedule produces steady, moderate responding. It's not frantic like variable ratio, but it keeps behavior going because the reward could come anytime. So to sum up, fixed ratio is the reward after a set number of action, fixed interval reward after a set amount of time, variable ratio reward after random number of actions, and the variable interval reward after a random amount of time. Each one shapes behavior in its own way. And understanding this pattern helps us decode everything from school habits, works, to addiction, to how we interact with the technology and the people around us. All right, let me bring you to the concept of cognitive learning. Cognitive learning is about the mental processes that happen behind the scenes, like attention, memory, and problem solving. It's the idea that learning is not just a reaction of reward or punishment. Instead, it involves activity, processing information, and making connections and figuring things out. Let's take a moment to look at this visual on the left. We've got a definition that really captures it. Cognitive learning involves internal mental activity and observation. That means we can learn just by watching others or by thinking through a problem, even if we're not physically doing anything. And on the right, check out that glowing brain image. It's a cool representation of what's happening inside our head when we learn. Neural connection lights up, ideas form, and we start building knowledge, not just through experience, but through understanding. Here's a quick example. Imagine you're trying to solve a puzzle. You're not getting any rewards. No one's giving you feedback, but still you're learning. You're testing strategies, remembering what worked, and adjusting your approach. That's cognitive learning in action. It's also why we can learn from reading, watching videos, or even reflecting on past experiences. Our brains are constantly pressing, organizing, and storing information, even when no one's handling us a cookie for doing it. So while behavioral psychology focuses on what we do, cognitive psychology asks why we do it and how our thoughts shape our action. To really understand where cognitive psychology comes from, we've got to look at its root. So this slide is just an overview of the historical foundation of the field. It's not just a list of old names. It's the story of how psychology evolved from observing behavior to exploring the mind. Let's begin with Wilhelm Wundt. Way back in the 1800s, he often called the father of experimental psychology because Wundt was one of the first to suggest that we could study mental processes scientifically using introspection and controlled experiments. He basically said, "Hey, the mind isn't just a mystery; it's something we can measure." And fast forward to the 1930s, and we meet Edward Tolman. He challenged the dominant behaviorist view at the time, which focused only on observable actions. Tolman introduced the idea of cognitive maps, or mental representations that help us navigate the world. He showed that when rats in mazes weren't just reacting, they were thinking. These early thinkers laid the groundwork for what we call now cognitive neuroscience, a field that blends psychology with biology to understand how the brain supports mental processes like memory, attention, and decision making. And why does this matter? Because it reminds us that psychology didn't just pop out of nowhere. It grew from decades of research, debate, and innovation. And today, when we talk about cognitive learning, we're standing on the shoulder of these pioneers who believed that the mind was worth studying, not just the behavior. Now, let's dig into the three viewpoints of cognitive learning. Let's kick off our discussion with the different viewpoints of cognitive learning with a bit of controversy because not everyone was on board with the idea of studying the mind. For instance, B.F. Skinner, one of the most influential figures in psychology and also one of the loudest critics of cognitive learning. If you look at this picture of him, hands on his head, it kind of says it all. Skinner wasn't just skeptical, he was against the whole idea of focusing on mental processes. Skinner believed that psychology should stick on what's observable, and that is behavior. He argued that thoughts, feelings, and internal mental activity were too subjective and unreliable to study scientifically. In fact, he he once called cognitive science creationism and even said it was the downfall of psychology. His work focused on animals in controlled environments like rats in Skinner boxes, as what we discussed a while ago, where he could measure behavior based on reinforcement and punishment. To him, it didn't matter why the rat pressed the lever or what it was thinking. What mattered was that it pressed the lever and got a reward. That was enough. Skinner's viewpoint shaped the field of behaviorism, which dominated psychology for decades. It emphasized learning through conditioning, reinforcement, and punishment without diving into the messy world of thoughts and cognition. In short, Skinner said, forget the mind, just watch the behavior. He rejected cognitive learning as unscientific, and he believed psychology should be grounded in hard, observable data. This sets the stage for the other viewpoints we'll explore, those that challenged Skinner and said, actually, the mind does matter. So we've seen how B.F. Skinner rejected the idea of studying mental processes. Let's flip the coin and look at someone who said, wait a minute, maybe there's more going on inside the mind than we think. Enter Edward Tolman, a psychologist who didn't just challenge behaviorism, he reimagined how we understand learning. Tolman believed that behavior wasn't just a reaction or reward of punishment. He argued that animals and humans use internal mental processes to learn. That's a big shift from Skinner's just observe the behavior approach. One of Tolman's most famous experiments involved rats in a maze. Now, Skinner would have focused on how many times the rat turned left or right based on reinforcement, but Tolman looked deeper. He found that rats could actually form a cognitive map, a mental representation of the maze layout, even when they weren't being rewarded. In other words, the rats learned the maze just by exploring it. No treats, no punishment, just pure mental processing. This was huge. It showed that learning could happen without reinforcement and that internal processes like memory, action, and problem solving were at play. Tolman's work laid the foundation for cognitive neuroscience, which combines psychology and brain science to understand how we think, learn, and remember. Going back to Skinner, he focused only on observable behavior. Tolman says mental processes matter. Now let's meet Albert Bandura, a psychologist who started out as a behaviorist but eventually became one of the strongest voices in favor of cognitive learning. He's best known for developing the social cognitive learning theory, which basically says we learn by watching others. Bandura believed that learning doesn't always require direct experience or reinforcement. Instead, we can learn just by observing, imitating, and modeling the behaviors of others. That's a huge shift from the idea that learning only happens through trial and error. Here, a simple example: imagine a child sees someone scream and run away from a spider. Even if the child has never had a bad experience with spider, they might start fearing them just from watching that reaction. No reward, no punishment, just observation and mental processing. Bandura emphasized that attention, retention, and motivation all play a role in this kind of learning. It's not just about copying, it's about thinking, remembering, and deciding whether to act. Now, question: do children learn by watching? Bandura showed that we don't always need rewards or punishment to learn. Sometimes just seeing someone else do something and how they're treated for it is enough to shape our behavior. In his famous studies, children watched adults act aggressively toward a doll. And guess what? Many of these kids imitated the same aggressive behavior. No one told them to do it. No one rewarded them. They just observed and copied. This kind of learning involves three key mental steps: attention, noticing what others do; memory, remembering what was seen; imitation, actually doing the behavior. So, yes, children do learn by watching. And actually, it's not just kids. We all do it. Whether it's picking up habits, attitudes, or even fear, observation plus mental processing can be just as powerful as direct experience. Let's take a closer look at one of the most iconic studies in psychology, the Boo Boo doll experiment by Albert Bandura. This experiment asks a simple but powerful question: do children learn by watching? And the answer, a resounding yes. Here's what Bandura did: he had children watch adults act aggressively toward a soft, inflatable toy called Bobo doll, punching it, kicking it, even yelling at it. Then, when the kids were left alone with the same doll, many of them copied the exact same aggressive behavior. No one told them to do it. No one rewarded them. They just modeled what they saw. This led to a major conclusion: observing aggression can lead to performing aggression. Bandura showed that children, and really all of us, can learn behaviors just by watching others. It's called modeling, and it doesn't require direct reinforcement. So this experiment was just about toys. It was about, this experiment, it was not just about toys. It was about how media, parenting, and social environment shape behavior. What we see, we absorb. What we absorb, we might repeat. It's a powerful reminder that learning is not always taught, it's caught. Another question: do you learn but not show it? Let's talk about something we've all experienced: knowing something but not showing it right away. That's the idea behind learning versus performance. According to Albert Bandura, just because someone doesn't perform a behavior does not mean they have not learned it. Learning can happen quietly, behind the scenes, and only show up when there is a reason, like motivation or reward. In one of Bandura's studies, children watched a model act aggressively, but here's the twist: some kids saw the model get punished, others saw the model get rewarded. Later, when those kids were given a chance to act out what they saw, the ones who saw punishment barely showed aggression. Only about zero point 0.5 responses on average, but the ones who were rewarded for imitating, They showed way more aggression, around 3.0 responses. So, what does this tell us? It tells us that learning happened in both groups, but performance depended performance depended on whether they were motivated to show it. This is called learning performance distinction. It means people may learn something just by observing, but they might not show it until there's a reason, like a reward, a challenge, or a safe environment. Bandura's cognitive social cognitive theory. This theory is all about how we learn by watching others, not just behavior, but also attitude, emotion, and social skills. Bandura emphasized three ingredients: observation, imitation, and self-reward. In other words, we don't always need someone to give us a prize or punishment to learn. Sometimes just seeing someone else do something and how they respond to it is enough to shape our own behavior. Take the example in this image. A woman watches, okay, I mentioned this a while ago. A woman watches someone calmly, but there's a child, no? Hold a tarantula. She is not being forced to touch it, and no one giving her a reward. But just by observing that fearless model, she might start to feel less afraid herself. That's learning through modeling. That is powerful. What makes Bandura's theory different from classical or operant conditioning is that it does not rely on direct experience. You don't have to be the one getting the reward or punishment. You just have to see it, process it, and decide what to do with it. Here are four key processes that make observational learning actually work. Because learning by watching isn't just automatic, it involves a few mental steps that help us absorb and apply what we see. Let's walk through them. First, we need to notice the behavior. It's attention. If we're distracted or not paying attention, we won't learn much. Example, watching someone calmly hold a spider without flinching, that moment grabs our focus, especially if we're afraid of spiders ourselves. Number two, memory. Next, we have to remember what we saw. It's not enough to just notice. We need to store that behavior in our minds so we can use it later. This is where mental processing kicks in. We encode the action, the context, and even the emotional tone. Imitation, number three. When then comes the part where we reproduce the behavior. We try to do what we saw, whether it's holding a spider, speaking confidently, or solving a math problem. This step depends on our ability and confidence to actually perform the behavior. Number four, motivation. Finally, we need a reason to imitate. Just because we can copy a behavior doesn't mean we will. Example, if someone wants to go camping with friends but fears spiders, they might be motivated to overcome that fear by imitating the fearless model. Have you ever suddenly figured out the answer to a problem after struggling with it for a while? If yes, that is called insight learning. So, insight learning, this type of learning was discovered by Wolfgang Kohler, who studied chimpanzees trying to solve problems. What he found was fascinating. Instead of slowly figuring things out through repetition, the chimps would suddenly get it like like a light bulb turning on, like a aha moment, like okay, this is how we do it. Instead, learning happens when we suddenly understand the relationship between parts of a problem. It's that moment when everything clicks. You're stuck, stuck, and then boom, you see the solution. Think of it like solving a puzzle. You stare at the pieces, try a few things, and then without warning, you realize how they fit together. That's insight. So, unlike other learning theories that focus on gradual changes, insights is sudden, mental, and often feels like a breakthrough. It shows that sometimes learning is about thinking, not just doing. All right, let's bring everything together with a quick recap of the key ideas we've covered about cognitive learning. We started with operant conditioning thanks to B.F. Skinner. He focused on how behavior is shaped by reward and punishment, strictly observable actions, no mental processes involved. Then moved into observational learning led by Albert Bandura. He showed us that we can learn just by watching others, no need for direct experience or reinforcement. Bandura also gave us the social cognitive theory, which breaks learning down into four mental steps: attention, memory, imitation, and motivation. It's not just about copying, it's about thinking through what we see and deciding when to act. We also explored insight learning, introduced by Wolfgang Kohler. This one's all about those sudden aha moment when understanding clicks and we solve problems by seeing the relationships between things. Cognitive learning expands beyond behaviorism. It shows that humans and animals think, reason, and observe to learn, not just to react to stimuli. Thank you very much.